My dad grew up in a small town in Minnesota that from the time I was in first grade and can remember until well into high school seemed completely timeless. Seemed like the town never changed. When you came in to town, there was a water tower that was silver that had this red kind of roof. It was shaped kind of like a bottle rocket. And then as you drove down on the one side of town, there was a little grocery store, the post office. There was a bar and grill, and then drugstore. And half of the drugstore was pharmacy kind of stuff, and the other half was merchandise. To me, the merchandise always felt like a museum. And it felt like they had the original pair of tennis shoes there if you wanted to still buy one of those first pairs that came out. On the other side of town was a farm implement kind of dealer. There was always some kind of animal feeding bin outside. The story was that my uncle would leave his books in there on the way home and pick them up on the way back to school the next day. A little bit further down was the cafe, the coffee shop, and then a car dealer where they had the lot was out at the one end of town, but where you could get your car fixed was at the other. And next to that was the meat locker, which my grandpa had owned and where he had been the butcher in town for many, many years. The one place I really remember most, though, is the cafe. It was a diner kind of a place, of a coffee shop. You could go in there, and I tried this at the first service. Every town I've been to a small town diner, the glasses were always the same color. Yellow, yes, thank you. And then they had coffee cups that were white, and they had this little kind of pattern around the top. What color was that? Green. I guess it came in lots of colors. Anyway, this diner was always the same, and one summer, instead of my parents driving us up for the week that we spent there, they sent us up on a plane, and while we were hanging out at Grandma and Grandpa's house, we walked the 2 blocks up to Main Street there, and we walked into the diner, and there were these farmers that we had never seen, and they turned around and looked at us when the bell on the door rang, and they looked at us, and one of them said, "You must be Hovind boys." They just knew. They could look at us and tell the people that we came from. Now, my dad was one of 5 brothers, and they all had different amounts and genders of kids. And so the one you could tell him figured, and then he said, "You must be Dean's kids," because he was the only one with 3 boys. And it blew my mind that I could walk into this place that I had never lived and only visited for a week, a year, and yet these people that I did not know could tell who we belonged to, and very particular who we belonged to, even if they didn't know our names as such. Now, in the years since then, I believe there was a fire that caused the drugstore to close, and it got turned into a spa. The last time I was there, I went to the coffee shop, and it's still a coffee shop, but now it has like couches and scones and lattes and all of the stuff of the diner is there. And I didn't see any farmers the day that we were in there. The grocery store has closed. The town has changed. And I have to tell you that I lament that, because in my childhood, that was the vacation we took. It was the only time we got to see our grandparents. And the timelessness and the steadiness of this place that never changed was just part of the steadiness of life that I felt my grandparents occupied, and that we got to live in that space with them. So I lament that it is not that way anymore. And if you come from a small town, you may lament the same things. You may lament that your school is now consolidated with the school in the next town over. Maybe the church isn't even open anymore because the town has shrunk down to that being unsustainable. But that kind of lament isn't just limited to small towns. I grew up in the suburbs, and when I go back home now, they've moved roads, and I can't find my way around all the time, and everybody has moved further out to the next suburb, and neighborhoods change, and we can lament that they're not the same anymore. If you grew up in a city, for as much as cities seem like they're just solid, they're always tearing stuff down and building new things, and the demographics of the neighborhoods are changing, and they don't look the way they did when we were there, and whatever it was that was stable, we lament that it's not that way anymore. We do it with church. Every time I gather the confirmation kids here, somebody looks at me and says, "You know, Pastor, we used to have to memorize the catechism." And I do know that, yes. I don't make them do that. They do other things. But we lament that the church isn't the way it is anymore. Even our kids among us, like if they're in 8th grade, would be, "Oh, school's not the same as it was in 6th grade. It's different now," right? And so we lament all of that change. Now today in the gospel story, we find Jesus lamenting a city. He is lamenting Jerusalem. But his lament is very particular. The story starts off with the threat of violence. The Pharisees of all people come to him and say, "Hey, Herod is out to kill you." Now Jesus is very dismissive of the threat. He just says, "Listen, I got stuff to do. I got people to heal, demons to cast out. I have work to be on my way doing. And he sends a message back to Herod. But it starts off with that violence. And then when he turns to talk about Jerusalem, he also talks about violence. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, he says, this city is the place where the prophets, what happens to the prophets there? They're killed. And the people that are sent there are stoned. And so Jesus is reflecting on the way that Jerusalem is violent. And he is also reflecting on the fact, even though it hasn't happened yet, right? He knows he is going to come there, just like the prophets, because he is a prophet and he has been sent. And he too is going to meet that violence death. So his entire reflection here on this place of Jerusalem is that it is a place of violence. And so he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I have longed to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks. It's this very motherly image of Jesus being like the mother that tries to protect the young, right? Now, Jesus is lamenting something different, though, than we lament. We so often lament that things have changed. Jesus isn't lamenting that Jerusalem has changed. He's lamenting that it hasn't. That the violent place it was for the prophets is the violent place that it still is. Now, amidst all of that, he looks at the people and says, your house is left to you. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I tried to gather you. I tried to take you to a different place that isn't so violent. See, he says, your house is left to you. What I think Jesus is saying is, you built this house of violence. I've tried to make it different. I've brought messages of love and grace. In the Gospel of John, he'll say, my Father's house has many rooms, and talks about that as this wonderful place. But here he says, this is your house. You built it. You get to live in it. Your house of violence is left to you. Now that's a word that ought to challenge us to maybe think about the ways that we lament. It's easy for me to look back at that little coffee shop in that town that has changed and to think, gosh, why did that happen? Right? That happened to me. This place that I go back to, it's all different now, and it feels like something that has changed that I had nothing to do with, because I've never lived there. We only visited once a year, and the older I got, that even got to be fewer and further between. But then I started to think about that town, and do we have any little mom and pop kind of diners where you can get coffee around here? Sure we do. Where do I get my coffee? Correct. The place with the couches and the lattes and the scones and all the rest of that. So I am making choices all the time that are different than choosing the coffee shop that I liked to visit as a kid. I choose the one that has replaced it. So even though that one isn't the one in my neighborhood, those very same choices that other people make are the same choices I make right here, right now. The grocery store in town closed. I would almost bet you that if you could look at the timeline of that, it probably had something to do with the Sam's or Costco or something opening up not too far off that people could go to, because we like to get our stuff cheap and in bulk, right? We've got Amazon. We can get stuff just delivered to your door. Even the drugstore in town, when they had their fire, maybe they looked around and said, you know what? People can get their drugs delivered half the time now, so what's the point of staying open and trying to fight with all of this? We like our stuff cheap and convenient, and we make choices like that all the time, and everything that happened in that little town happened because of the very same choices I make now in the place that I live. Similarly, with the violence that is in our world, we can lament that. I have lamented this week what has happened in New Zealand. And for me, it's been a deep lament, because each time one of these mass shootings happen, it seems like I know somebody that's close to it in some way. When the one happened at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, I emailed the pastor that was close by just to offer some prayers of support. And he had already talked to my internship supervisor on the phone, who was in Haiti that day. But he had already talked to him because he had been at the church that was very close to Columbine High School. And when the one happened in Pittsburgh, I emailed my colleague that was close to there because he was already in a community dealing with these things. We are connected to all of this violence that we lament. And it's not just gun violence in schools and in places of worship. It is the wars that we seem to be now immersed in all the time with terrorism and drugs. It's the opioid crisis, which grows out of violence and touches so many of our communities. It's domestic violence and all of this violence that surrounds us in so many ways. And we can lament it and feel like it is something that is happening to us. But just like I have to be honest with myself about that coffee shop and the choices I make, we maybe ought to listen to Jesus' words your house is left to you, and think about the ways that maybe we contribute to, the choices that we make that lead to this violence. I spent my internship in Littleton, Colorado, when we were there when they hit the 10-year anniversary of the Columbine shootings. That day they opened up the church. It's a beautiful sanctuary that is low in the back where you come in and rises up to like 2 stories, 3 stories high at the front end. The ceiling is this kind of opaque glass, so light comes in. There's windows that look out onto the mountains, and this huge wooden statue of the resurrected Jesus right up at the part of the chancel. And that space was opened up that day for prayer of remembrance. And there were a few people that came and went, but there was one woman who stayed all day. She came as soon as the sanctuary opened, and she sat vigil and prayed in that place all day. On the day of the shootings, she had a different vigil. Her oldest daughter, was in school that day at Columbine and was on the very last bus that night of kids that had been evacuated and taken to another place for their parents to meet them. So with every successive bus, her prayers got deeper and more desperate, waiting for that child to finally get off of one. And here, 10 years later, a parallel vigil of prayer to try to sit in that same space and look for some grace. And now we're 10 years further on, and I would ask the question, what have we done to change this violent culture we live in? Nothing is the quick answer, right? But the actual answer is we've gotten more guns and loosened gun laws in lots of places to where it's made it even more violent. Now, in the psalm that we read today, there's a little bit that said there are false witnesses that breed violence. All those many years ago, the psalmists could look around their community before Jesus was even around and say that there are false witnesses that breed violence. What that means is that the world has always had this story that violence is somehow redemptive, that if we can just protect ourselves and arm ourselves and fight against everybody else, that we somehow will get to a place that is safe. And yet, the more and more we buy into that story, and the more guns we get, and the more violence that we perpetrate, and whether that's locally or around the world, go home and Google how many military bases that we have in the world. It's way more than you would think. It's a lot. In the, like, couple of hundred, I think. And also in there, you can look and start to maybe research and wonder, like, what is it that's happening in South and Central America with all the violence that sends people our way? Do we have anything to do with that violence? I watched the Iran-Contra hearings when I was in middle school when I was home all summer. That was all about us sending weapons someplace, was it not? Taking the guns that we created and sending them off to other places. We have gotten involved in regimes and regime changes, and we have our own violence that we have exported and our own drug problems that bring this stuff to us. And all of that is to say, we make choices. I can look at that coffee shop and pretend like it's something that just happened, but I made choices that helped that to happen. And all of this violence that around us comes from choices that we make. Sometimes it's a choice to be silent. Sometimes it's a choice to believe in the story of violence. But we do have voices, and we have communities, and there are ways that we can enter into these way that we live together differently. We can make different choices, but we haven't. And so we live with this violence around us all the time. Now, the last word that we get in this story is not, your house is left to you. It's your house is left to you until Jesus comes back and we sing, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Does that sound like a word of grace? You don't sing, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord unless you're in a good place, right? And so Jesus, when he was in this world, he could have made the same choices. He could have believed the false witnesses that said violence is the answer, but instead, he died on the cross. He let that happen to him. When Pilate was questioning him, asking him if he's a king, and Jesus says, well, yeah, I am, except for the people that follow me. If I was your kind of king, they would be fighting, but they're not, because my kingdom is a different kingdom. Jesus came into the world to give us a different story, a story of death, yes, but also then a story of resurrection life. And it is that resurrection life that we are invited to live into even now, so that we can sing, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. On Friday, I had the opportunity to go to Friday prayers at the mosque. It was heartbreaking. When a couple of times we've had shootings in Christian churches here in our country, I've never thought that now all of a sudden everyone that's Christian is in danger. right? Usually it's sort of like, well, that was a disturbed person that attacked that place. But when you sit in a mosque, as they are now processing what has happened as yet another act of violence has happened against Muslim people, they feel the threat. There were cop cars all outside when I got there because Orange County felt like they needed to make sure that it was a safe place. And in that place, on that day, the Imam got up and reflected on shootings in places of worship. And the first one he mentioned was not the mosque. It was the one at the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And then he mentioned the one at the church in Texas. And then he talked about the one in New Zealand. And then he talked about the things we talk about: peace, hope, and bringing love into the world. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord and brings love into the world. Last night there was a gathering downtown of included a Jewish cantor who prayed in Hebrew and led the group of people in a prayer. There were two Christian guys that sang Amazing Grace as two Muslim women stood nearby, weeping and holding each other in their arms. All of this gathered in one place, people building a different kind of community, rejecting the voices of violence and hatred and starting to build a different way. And this is the path that Jesus invites us on. Sometimes it is in a whole community that is interreligious, but sometimes it's just in our neighborhoods. When we choose love instead of hate, when we choose peace instead of violence. It can happen in our schools and in our workplaces, and all of the ways that we can choose a different path. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. This is what we will sing, right, as we see Jesus, but we know he's already raised, so we should be singing it now and carrying that into the world. How is it that we are known by God? How do we know we are known? What is the marking for us? Cross, right? And the waters of baptism. When I walked into that cafe, they looked at us and said, "You're hoping, boys. Must be Dean's kids." They didn't know my name, right? When we go out into this world, how will people know us as Jesus' people? There's a song. They'll know we are Christians by our love, right? This is a commandment that we hear in John 13. Love your neighbors, right? They will know us by our love. As we go out into this world, may people know us in that way. May we sing these words, right? Blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord. May our acts of mercy and our acts of grace and the different kind of community we build touch people so that even if they don't know our names, they will know us by our love so that they too can sing, blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Amen.